What's the difference between this and this? It's incredibly common to see these lines blurred when people talk about video games, with games like Dark Souls being unfairly labeled as, well, unfair. So I wanted to make this video because 1, it's a really interesting topic that has a lot of converging viewpoints, and 2, because I wanted to clear up some misconceptions about unfairness in games. For a game to be considered fair, it needs to have consistency, which essentially boils down to everything in the game following the rules. Things need to stay the same and react the same every time. Stuff like having the same number of invincibility frames on a dodge, recall patterns being the same every time, or the floor being solid all of the time. To allow the player to learn, first you need to establish the parameters of the game. The rules need to be consistently enforced across the entire experience and apply to everything. Having randomness interjected into the game is sort of the antithesis to this idea, and it's generally the core of why a game feels unfair. Something like bloom mechanics in shooters, for example, is a really clear case of how randomness makes a game feel unfair. If you're not familiar with it, bloom is when your bullets hit randomly in an area around where you're aiming. It creates situations where a player can fire at a target with 100% accuracy, and whether they hit every shot or 0 shots is completely up to chance. It makes the success of the player completely random. Like, imagine if the same sort of thing was applied to Dark Souls' roll, for example, as in when you press circle or B if you're on an Xbox controller, or like shift or something. I don't know. I don't think anyone really plays Dark Souls on PC. You had a random number of invincibility frames between 4 and 8. That shit just wouldn't work, and that logic can essentially be applied to any mechanic in any game. If randomness is added, it's going to feel unfair to someone, and so you just shouldn't do it. This also kind of ties into the wider principle that fair games follow, which is simply success should be entirely dependent on the player's skill, which is pretty broad and all-encompassing, but it's quite useful, since you can sort of view anything through that lens and come out with an idea of whether it's a fair or unfair mechanic. Consistency in games also allows the player to better understand their abilities and the aspects of the world around them. Knowing exactly how high you can jump in a platformer, or exactly how long you can run in an action RPG, means you can more accurately assess what you should do in a situation, like some sort of beast. Like, take Dark Souls, for example, and yes, I know I'm going to be talking about Dark Souls a lot. Isn't that funny little green bar up here useful? Yes, the answer is yes, and it's because it allows you to accurately assess your options. This thing drains at a consistent rate every time. Your roll and your sprint are the same speed every time. You know exactly what your capabilities are, and you're given the information to use them at maximum efficiency, which is why complicated bosses that really require you to optimize the way you play, like Ornstien and Smough, work so well, and it's also why you can't beat them, because you're garbage and trash and bad at video games and stupid. Telegraphing in games is also very important for fairness, and this is usually talked about just in reference to action RPGs, but it's also really important for any game, because telegraphing also encompasses the visual language used in games to communicate ideas and concepts, etc, etc. The easiest way to explain this is with a super extreme example. Something like this seemingly normal floor in a normal platformer that would be safe to stand on, right? Wrong, and you're dead. The issue: telegraphing. The player needs to know, or at least have a hint of, an attack coming and what kind of attack is coming, so they can effectively decide on how to respond to said attack. The game needs to make it clear where the threat is and when the threat is. When this isn't done properly, it leads to players being unclear about what response to take, and upon inevitably making the wrong choice, feeling cheated out of a death, because from their point of view, the game stopped following its own rules. Although this can be done in much more subtle ways than literally showing the player where the danger is, by establishing potential danger early on in the game. Dark Souls 1 actually does this about 3 minutes into the game, when it rolls a massive boulder at you that most players wouldn't be observant enough to notice. I know I definitely didn't. Doing this tells the player, hey, we're going to be fucking with you like this all game, so you should be very aware of your surroundings. It's sort of like pre-telegraphing. Hitboxes also come under this umbrella, and they're frequently the unwilling recipient of abuse when attacks are poorly telegraphed. A game that really has this problem is Code Vein, an anime Souls-like with bosses that seem to have a very poor understanding of how to telegraph their moves. This one in particular is completely incomprehensible, and while I'm sure once you know what the hell is going on, it's easy, it isn't exactly clear without studying the code which part of this mess is going to hurt you and which part isn't. If you're sitting there thinking, ha ha ha, bad Dark Souls clone can't do Dark Souls right, then you should probably know that Dark Souls also has this problem, although nowhere near as much. The Gaping Dragon in Dark Souls 1 is the most obvious example, with its instant full body hitbox when the walking attack starts, which is absolutely insane. The games that do telegraphing right have good hitboxes that line up with the models well, excellent animations that have clear startup, active, and recovery frames, and take into consideration which part of the enemy is vulnerable to an attack and communicate that to the player. When all these things are done right, you get something like Genichiro from Sekiro, which is such a disgustingly good boss that I could make a whole video just talking about everything it does right. And while we're on the topic, I also want to mention Sekiro's excellent use of audio telegraphing alongside its visual telegraphing. For example, the low thud notifying you of when an enemy is about to do a thrust, which is distinct enough from the rest of the audio that it really cuts across while remaining on theme. Getting the player to learn from their mistakes is the end goal for a challenging game, and it requires everything else I've talked about to be working. The player needs to understand what they did wrong and what they should have done. This can only be achieved if the game is consistent, but it can't just stop at this. What the player learns needs to hold over into future encounters. The rules can't change, and the player's base capabilities can't either, so by making mistakes and learning from them, the player is learning principles that will allow them to succeed at any point in the game, not just memorizing inputs like they would in a troll game. You aren't just teaching the player how to beat one encounter, you're teaching them how to be better at the game overall, since every encounter is going to follow the same rules. Another key element to get the player to learn is ensuring that the player understands the type of challenge they're faced with, giving them a sort of idea on what succeeding would look like. Not literally giving the player the answer, but at least having them know which mechanics to use to overcome the challenge. Unfortunately, Sekiro, my beloved, kind of has this problem, since a lot of players, especially those with past experience with the Souls series, see the dodge with iframes and try to brute force every encounter with just that, even though the enemies are specifically designed to be fought using the parry mechanics. It creates a frustrating situation for the player where they seemingly have the solution as it kind of works, but really they're missing the point of the challenge and what skill it's trying to test, leading to a very uncomfortable experience of drawn out engagements with enemies that otherwise would be very enjoyable to fight, all because the game just doesn't make it quite clear enough that, hey, that's not really gonna work and you should totally be doing this. In Sekiro's case in particular though, I think this could be written off as an awkward holdover to a new combat system. And obviously, yes, these last two sections have been me simping over Sekiro, but it's really good, and if you haven't played it, you should totally play it. To recap, the difference between a challenging game and an unfair game is consistency in mechanics, accurate telegraphing of threats to the player, opportunities for the player to learn principles that will work throughout the whole game, and a general basis of all progress happening as a result of the player's skill. When a challenging game works, it really works, and since the purpose of art at its core is to draw emotion out of the viewer, whether those emotions are good or bad, challenging games like Dark Souls definitely manage to do that. Thanks for watching.